read an article this morning in the newspaper about the abolition of PowerPoint. Why PowerPoint should be abolished. The argument was presented through a PowerPoint. So I'm a bit concerned about reading that this morning because I think we suffer from some of the limitations of PowerPoint in our presentation. Open access is nothing new. Openness, David has referred to a number of these applications that are open educational resources. In this world where increasingly we're relying on global education, in particular if we talk about MOOCs, I mean the name itself has the word open in its acronym, massive open online courses. So the concept that Fred and I will be presenting is that open access promised a great deal back some almost 20 years ago where it really took off. And Fred is going to wind up by giving us some of the drawbacks or the realities that we've been facing through open access. So our outline is this, you don't really need to know that. We're talking about access, which primarily talks about research output, and then a little bit about education resources, and then Fred's going to talk about open data, which is a very topical item here at Hong Kong U, as our Senate just 2.5 weeks ago passed a data policy, data retention policy, so we'll talk about that. And I apologise because I will be pointing, and I'm only going to point at the middle screen. So an open access definition here, free, immediate, online, rights to use fully in a digital environment. So this was a definition formulated by SPARC. Who is SPARC? SPARC is the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition. They were formed by the Association of Research Libraries, ARL, which I'll be referring to again, in 1997. 1997, for a number of reasons. It was kind of a watershed year for libraries, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So ARL, as I say, the Association of Research Libraries, is the top 120 or thereabouts, it changes from time to time, research libraries in North America. So, what happened in 97? Well, scholars had been exchanging their research output through several means. First and foremost, through the traditional journal output. And as technology became improved through internet and the web, scholars were finding that the traditional methodology was a bit limited and it was taking time. So they were sharing individually, independently. So their preprints, for example. What also happened in the world of libraries, you can see, and I'm only going to point out two. First one is the line that hits right at the top. This is the cost or the expenditure increase from 1986 to 2012 of these top research libraries in North America. And that 456% increase over that period is for what we call, in the library world, serials, or journals, or periodicals. Serials, and they're called serials because they repeat, like a serial offender or a serial murderer. So 456 is pretty significant, and those expenditures take up usually around 80 to 85% of library materials budgets, and you can see increasingly so. So overall expenditure in libraries increased by 188% over the same period in these ARL institutions. And then if you look at the red line, the CPI increased only 109%. So there's a great disconnect there between what we're paying for serials, these repetitive expenditures, and what the CPI should dictate. And we're still seeing that today. We expect inflation of about, probably 2 to 3% perhaps of some of the major journals, but they're charging us 5 to 10, and that's happening every year. So librarians got a little bit fed up with this. So this SPARC was formed, this SPARC, Scholarly Publications and Academic Resources Coalition. And some would see them as really being quite zealous in terms of their definition of open access. But we may say a bit more about that in a moment. Okay, at the same time, library expenditures, and once again, these are three categories of the ARL: private ARL libraries, public ARL libraries, And then the green ones, who invest, are the Canadian ARL libraries. So there are some Canadians amongst the North American group. And you can see this is a library percentage as a total percentage of university expenditure. So university expenditure, quite large, but the allocation to library decreasing, serials increasing 456%. Something's wrong. Something's got to give. This quote from the Education Advisory Board, and once again it's North America, but I think we have a lot to learn from it. And Harvard were very much behind this. Harvard said, we're no longer promising that we can purchase and own everything for all of our scholars. We are going to increasingly rely on providing access. Access through two sources. One, open access materials, and two, sharing with other libraries, other major libraries. So no longer is Harvard committed to purchasing and owning everything for their faculty. Things really took off in the early 2000s where, there were a few movers and shakers, particularly in the UK, who were pushing for this. Stephen Harnad, in particular, was very forward in pushing for mandating open access of research output. And the Wellcome Trust is a major funder of, in particular, biomedicine. It's a global institution, but it's based in the UK. So they said, access to research is restricted, and just take a note here, by a market in which a small number of publishers, and that's something that I want to emphasise, it's a small number of publishers who are, well, they're not monopolising it because there's a number, but it is a small number. And then the UK government got involved through its House of Commons and Science and Technology Committee and basically said it's not up to publishers or academics to decide who should have access to research that's been funded by our government, or by research funders. So there's a disconnect that, well, we'll show you in a moment. Okay, that was back in 2003, 2004. This is 2011. And so now it's creeping into the popular press. This is from The Guardian. And this is, of course, Rupert Murdoch. Now, I think you all know that Rupert Murdoch is not a socialist, right? You would agree. Let me tell you, Rupert Murdoch, and no disrespect to Rupert Murdoch, because he is a former fellow countryman of mine and David's. He chose to go to greener pastures and become a US citizen. I'm sure it was not financially motivated, but culturally motivated. Rupert's value or worth is estimated at $14 billion US dollars. $14 billion US dollars. That's 14 and 9 zeros. Expenditure by libraries and research institutes on STEM, only STEM journals, science, technology, engineering, and medicine, so forget about the arts and humanities, just STEM, is $10 billion. Okay, so who's worse? Is it Rupert owning $14 billion? Now he invested that obviously, but at the moment it's $14 billion. But that $10 billion is paid every year with an inflationary factor built in around 5 to 10%. So you can understand the catch line of this. So the process in the traditional publishing model for research articles is this, and I am going to point, but if you start at the top left, essentially the government or a funding body, a grant funding body, issues research funding proposals, bids are made, and grants are awarded. The research is undertaken, the output from the research is submitted to a journal for peer review, it is accepted, and at the point of acceptance, the author who has created the output assigns the copyright to the journal or to the publisher. So the disconnect, or the problem area for me is in the first place, where the government RFPs are issued, and then the assignation of the copyright to the publisher. The publisher then locks that article away into mainly closed access journals, to which then libraries, such as my own, need to subscribe in order to allow only our faculty and students to have access to. So if you think about wanting to put those things into your MOOCs, forget about it. You'll be in big trouble. Elsevier will be knocking on my door and telling you to fix the problem. So there's limited public access to that, and it leads to slower scientific progress. This is the argument. Okay? So I know that there are other arguments, we can talk about those for a long time. But the problem is government has provided funding for the research. The government has provided funding to the university. It's given to the library to resubscribe. So we are, in effect, paying twice to get access to that research. One, to create it, second, to get access to it. In an optimised open access model, we would see at the initial stage the government saying that there are open licence requirements with the issue of this funding. That is, if you accept this grant, your research output must be made publicly available. There may be certain conditions under which that is made, but that is increasingly what's happening, and I'm going to give some examples in a moment or two. What happens, the process of research, the article is submitted to a journal, peer review occurs, acceptance is made by the journal, with public access policy ensuring that it can be deposited in an open repository, whether it's the own publishers or the own institutions or even the grant funders. The articles are then published in one of those repositories. There may be an embargo imposed by the publisher and or the author may wish to embargo. But essentially, the public can then download it, can be reused through a Creative Commons license. And the theory is that it improves access, improves research, and speeds up research. Okay, so these are the promises of open access, and I'm not going to read through them, but essentially there are promises, that open access is going to change the world, is going to change the world of publishing, change the world of research output. And I think we could argue at each one of those points that perhaps there has been some success, perhaps some areas have had greater success than others. Academics, it's meant to produce greater impact of their work fundamentally. For librarians, it was meant to bring down the costs that they were paying for academic resources, for research output. And for the public, the public can get access to the research output that they've indirectly funded through their taxes. But probably the most significant one is that developing countries who simply cannot afford to break down those paywalls of the major publishers can get access to these resources. So that's the promise. All right. Anybody heard of Ithaca, SNR? They're a research body in North America. They publish research on electronic and informational use in North American institutions. And they've been branching out this survey into other areas. They've done it in Australia, they've done it in the UK. In April this year, they did it in Hong Kong. 4 of us participated. This is the results from Hong Kong U. We only had 115 that responded to this question, but it shows the support for open access that we have on our campus, which I think if we'd done this 5 years ago, it would have been significantly less. Basically, the large blue bar at the top is saying, do you support mandatory open access for peer-reviewed articles, conference proceedings? And strongly agreed to agree, 5 to 6, by about 76%. About 14% are so-so about it, and 10% are opposed or strongly opposed to it. So I think we've got a fairly good critical mass to further exploit openness in terms of certainly journal articles and proceedings, but you can see there are varying degrees of support for other types of materials, such as working papers, data, which we'll come to, and monographs. 2 types of open access, and the one that I think is probably most commonly known to people is that which is green. So the article is published in a journal, but then the author is given the rights to reproduce a variation, or a version, I should say, of that article in an open access repository, sometimes with an embargo. In terms of gold open access, there are journals that are dedicated to gold open access, which means the author pays for the processing of that article, then the article is free to everybody in the world. Or there are hybrid journals in which individual articles are open access within a subscribed journal. Okay, this is our institutional repository. Its emphasis to date has really been on research output. We are starting to look at teaching and learning output, but once again, Fred's going to say a bit more about that. This is a disciplinary repository. This was created by Cornell University Library. Once again, this is one of the earliest ones, and I think it was the late 90s that this evolved. Its emphasis is on physics and mathematics. This is a grant funder repository, so the European PubMed Central, who provide grants, one of the conditions of issuing those grants is that their output comes into their repository. Okay, so the difference, this is Hong Kong U's institutional repository. It's a record for an article called Metabolic Effects of Secretin. That's the record. Here is the version of it itself. It's fairly plain. It is no doubt a preprint, so it's the version that, the final version that went to the publisher before any final editing was done. And here you can see the publisher's website where it appears. It's a lot fancier. It has certain value-added attributes there, such as the keywords on the left, similar materials, and so on. And then the full text of it is, again, slightly different, but the content is fundamentally there. This is an open access journal. It's a complete open access journal, so all the articles within here are fully open access. This is a hybrid. Some of them, it says free full text, but this one doesn't say that, so it is not free. And there will be examples throughout the contents page where you can click for free, or otherwise, if it doesn't say that, you'll be asked to produce your credit card or get your library to do that. Okay, some recent developments, and I'm only going to touch on 3 of these. With this one, the HEFI, REF. So HEFI is the Higher Education Funding Commission of England, and they fund, well, as its name suggests, higher education in England. And the RAF is their research excellence framework, akin to our RAE in Hong Kong, Research Assessment Exercise. And the HEFI in 2014 said that from January 1, 2016, any articles or conference proceedings submitted to be assessed as part of the next RAF must be open access. If it's not open access, you cannot submit it. We will not assess it. Even China has got into the act last year, approximately 1 year ago in May, yes, about 1 year. The National Science Federation and the Chinese Academy of Sciences also mandated that research output from their funding must be made open access within 12 months. And even in Hong Kong, our RGC, 3 types of their funding now require open access. So, open education resources, similar concept, but different format. So we've heard David earlier talk about some of the applications that he has made open access, openly available. Fundamentally, they are public domain, open license, legal, free, adapt, reshare. There can be variations of those terms. Not all of them may be adaptable, for example. Once again, it comes back to the author or the creator making that decision. But the difference in the content is, whereas OA focused on primarily journals and to some extent monographs, this is really more about education resources, curricula, syllabi, lecture, and so on and so forth. And I know I'm running out of time. Fred's got a lot to say as well. I mentioned earlier that the author or the creator can attribute different licenses and decide what terms under what terms their output may be used. The Creative Commons provides that. It provides a series of licenses. Here you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them. At the top is the most open, and down the bottom is the least open. And there is a very simple flow chart that you can follow. So the first question, do you want to be acknowledged? No. Then it's completely open. It's a public domain, CCO, no rights reserved. If I do want acknowledgement, yes. Can people change and reuse it? No. Can it be used commercially? No. So it's CC, BY, NC, ND. And these are legal documents that you assign and you have attributed to your work. I'm going to skip on that. And once again, the cycle for creating educational resources, the critical point comes really at the assignment of the funding, just like the open access and the research output of articles and so on, and then the copyright attribution. So this is once again in a fairly traditional methodology where there's no determination by the funding body to require open access or an open license. So really the difference is that. Just some examples of open education resources. Merlot was one of the earlier ones. Merlot was created by Cal State University back in 1997. It seems to be a watershed year. It's still in existence and still being contributed to. Jorum is created by JISC, which is the Information Services Committee, the Joint Information Services Committee in the UK, which brings together IT specialists, librarians, and education technologists. And that has a large repository of resources, all freely available for use. NSDL, the National Science Digital Library, and finally the OER, which is from the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management, coming from Silicon Valley. And it covers all disciplines, education, arts, right through to mathematics and statistics. So with that, I'm going to have you talk to Fred, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that we've been involved in recently.
Okay, so my part is about open data and also reproducible research. These are actually two very linked concepts. Open data here, we can refer them to both research data and also government data. As long as they are online, they are free, accessible, and then you can use, reuse, and distribute them. And then reproducible research is actually that the science is free access to experimental elements for research reproduction. So over the years, there have been some crises of credibility inside the academia. So people actually more concerned about how the science is actually carried out. Can we really carry out those experiments, either in computational methods, in statistical methods, or in empirical methods? So these are some core elements of why these concepts are linked together. So just a little bit of a taxonomy. You can see that we just mentioned open access on the top, and then you see open data, and then you see open reproducible research. Actually, they are all interlinked together, and the bigger theme, according to this website by EU, is called open science. But actually, you can really see that it is actually a whole family of an open movement. So there are three reasons why there is a need for open research data. On the left-hand side, this is a publication by Microsoft. It is called the fourth paradigm. So if you have heard of the term paradigm in science by Kuhn, and then at the very beginning it's empirical science, later on it's theoretical, and then it comes to computational, and then right now at the present, data becomes so important that it is now a new paradigm for e-science. So this is why data is so important. And then in the middle, it is a publication by the Royal Society of the UK. It mentions that the conduct and communication of science needs to adopt to the new era of IT. So this is actually technology driven, that now data has become more accessible and can be reused for different purposes. And finally, this is a report which has been submitted to the European Commission. It calls for a collaborative infrastructure that would really allow the public to exploit research data to maximum benefit. In a while, I will show you why this benefit is so important that we can actually benefit a lot from this cost savings. This is a diagram called the changing scholarly communication. You can see all those fancy art here. It's actually the tools or the workflows that is changing because of the development of new software or technologies. And you know that actually with these new tools and new methods, there can be new work methods or even new paradigms for research. And as a result, because everything is changing so rapidly, there is now a need for you to look into the research life cycle to see how you can embrace these changes. All right. So in terms of the value of research data, this is published by Australian National Data Services. You can see that on this right-hand side, it is actually a diagram shows that the more increasing access to properly funded research data, actually the benefits is more. You can see that the benefits of data infrastructure can be up to $5.5 billion if there is increasing access of research data to the public. So this is really a lot of money And this is actually done by some careful estimation. If you're interested, you can look at the report. But I think the general feel is that research data is valuable, and they should not be just kept in a single computer. And the public can really benefit if they have access to it. Okay, this is a table compiled by the Digital Curation Centre of the UK. You can see that there is increasing funders mandates in terms of data management, and you can see that in this column, access and sharing is actually required by each and every major funder in the United Kingdom, including the Wellcome Trust, the EPSRC, ESRC, etc. So this is really, the movement is actually already been very progressive. And then a similar diagram in the US, you can see that after the policy is passed, the funders also make changes, in particular the National Institute of Health and also the National Science Foundation. So data access and sharing is very important. Previously, we mentioned about some of the promises of open access, the benefits, etc. But there are some realities that we must face. So first of all, there is a misconception that the open access journals, the quality is not good. They may not have the same rigorous peer review process, which is debatable. And then the second point is that although you can publish in open access journal, whether or not you can get promoted or get your tenure is another question. What is the impact factor of the open access journals? Are they as good as those traditional prestigious journals? The fourth point is that the fees are actually very significant for you to publish in open access. On average, it will be like $1,500 for a single article. So can you really get funding for that? And is it really suitable for all disciplines? And what is the support that we are actually providing? Are we really creating, or we are just focusing on dissemination? So these are questions that we can actually think about. In terms of the quality, a year ago that the directory of open access journals, there are some speculations that their quality is not good. So there are some concerns about the quality of OA journals. And then later on, just recently, they have introduced new standards to help to address the concern on quality. But how it goes, it remains to be seen. Okay. In terms of the course, this is a recent publication by the Research Consulting in UK. You can see that the compliance cost of the RC UK, which is the Research Grant Council in UK, of the open access policy amounts to like 9.2 million UK pounds per year, which is a lot of money. And the problem is that there isn't a system-wide efficient system for the payment and tracking of those article processing charge. So at present, there is still coordination issues as well as the financial implication for the universities to comply with the funders' requirement. So these are some realities. And in terms of impact, there are studies conducted to see if open access actually increases citation, and somehow it does, but somehow it does not. There is probably a context-specific implication of open access publication and the citation. The association still, we can't be very sure about that. So we need to bear in mind that it's not definite. Just a few more. There is something called the bills list, which is a list that includes some of the predatory scholarly open access publishers. So these are actually publishers publishing OA journal, but they are not in good quality. They just want your money. So these are the numbers that we found as of present. It's quite a lot. So check this out if you want to submit a publication and not to get fooled. So just a few more slides before I wrap up. It's about the open access at the University of Hong Kong. This is the university IPR policy. In the first section, it states that the university is signatory to the Berlin Declaration on Open Access. So the university support open access, and all our postgraduate visas are actually in open access domain. And then it also specifies the policy that the authors can post work on the university IR, the Hong Kong Youth Scholars Hub, and that the university encourages the staff to submit their file version of the published work, which is a manuscript, either is preprint or postprint, to the hub to facilitate knowledge sharing. So this is what is happening in Hong Kong U. And then just very recently, we also have the first research data policy passed in Hong Kong. So this research data policy is actually based on Oxford Universities, and then it mainly concerns deposit for reproducible research and to maintain integrity. But actually, later on, I believe this could be a long-term vision in terms of sharing. And then we will now have a task force formed. This would include the URC members, ITS, the library, the faculty, as well as the archives. So these are something happening in Hong Kong U. And then for Hong Kong U libraries, we are actually the first and only, probably right now, the library subsidized open access publishing to a certain extent. So these are the things you can take a look at. Okay, just to wrap up this session, in our libraries, we maintain the Hong Kong U Scholars Hub. I believe many of you know that. So actually, all these elements are actually linked together so that we can make the researchers and the research discoverable. And by that, I believe the researchers and Hong Kong U can benefit from the visibility that we are trying to portray. So just in case if you have any ideas of what you want to know more, then you can write to us. And in the future, we are on the plan that whether or not we can further enhance our Scholars Hub in terms of inclusion for research data so that it could be linked to the publication, and then potentially this would also increase citation of the publication and the impact. And then we will also discuss whether or not learning objects can be put in Scholars Hub so that actually it showcases more than just the research. But these are something that is going on. But we believe that by promoting this hub, Hong Kong U and the public can really benefit from this knowledge exchange. So that would be the end of this presentation, and please feel free to ask any questions. This presentation will be archived in Hong Kong U Scholars Hub.
Through Creative Commons.
Through Creative Commons CC-BY.
I know it's about tea break time, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
I'd like to know about the online learning material, the videos created by the teachers for learning. For example, our book videos, or some other teachers, they record their own teaching and the video. So is it accessible now? And according to the current policy, can others reuse them, maybe not for the commercial purpose, but for other academic purpose, or recreate that? What's the current situation now?
Yes. The answer is yes. You can reutilize those. I mean, if you've created them, for example, you can use them in your MOOCs. I mean, our people are doing that right now with all of our MOOCs, creating videos of teaching and other sorts which are being used beyond our campus. So yes.
But my question is, for example, if that teacher left Hong Kong U, so the videos created owned by the faculty, by the university, or by the staff, can you think of ways?
I think it's according to the IPR policy. I think according to the IPR policy, this work generated by the staff, actually the university has a non-exclusive rights for non-commercial purposes, royalty-free worldwide rights to use them for non-commercial purposes.
Okay, no more questions. Thank you so much. Let's give them another round of applause.